Our guests live a life of meaning and purpose, making their dreams come true. That's what makes regular people exceptional. Become empowered. Hello, Phil. Very good morning. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Lovely to see you, Anna.
Muchas gracias por estar aquí.
Es un placer.
Phil is one of those rara avis who can speak Spanish as well as English, which is his first language. Bill is a beautiful human being whose purpose in life is to add value. The way that Phil is adding value nowadays, well, one of the ways that he's adding value is by being a trainer of NLP, neurolinguistic programming, which in very basic terms, Phil, if you allow, it's a way of us being able to talk to ourselves better and also to interact with other people. However, you are the expert. Please tell us more about NLP, which I find fascinating.
Yes, I mean, it's a really deep study that was done in the early 1970s over a period of about 9 years. And it really was a very in-depth study of how do we communicate with ourselves and everyone else. And what was observed, what was discovered in that study that led to the creation of NLP was they worked out what the mechanisms were. How do we store memories? How do we think? How do we notice things? How do we take in information through our senses and make sense of it? How do we know what words mean? How does language work? All of those things were really studied in the creation of NLP. So NLP really is a comprehensive view, observation, understanding, a testing, if you like, of how human beings do everything that human beings do. So that's what makes it so powerful, really.
Wow. In a nutshell, there's a lot of information there. One thing that you've mentioned there is memories and how we think. Something that I've listened to is that our memories are not in our brain.
I would agree.
Is that true?
Well, certainly that's what was discovered with NLP is although we have the idea that our memories are stored like films in a library in our nervous system somewhere, in fact, what happens is when we think about the past, we create it. In other words, we actually imagine it. So, for example, if you think about if you had breakfast earlier and you can think, yeah, I remember what I had for breakfast. How do you do that? You get images, you get smells, you get tastes. It's almost like you relive having your breakfast. But when you're doing that, you're not having your breakfast. You're just using your imagination. And so people think that, well, there's a stored memory. You just go and open the file and there's your breakfast. No, you're recreating it by imagination. So you're going back and you're thinking, I remember this and I remember that, and you reconstruct it. So memories are remade. And that's why when we think that our memory is perfect, we're fooling ourselves because it really isn't. And one of the interesting things is when you get 2 or 3 people who were in the same place having the same experience, and maybe sometime later they're talking about what happened, and people are always surprised at the differences in memories of the circumstance. But the fact was every single person was making their own internal movie of what they can recollect of that experience. So we actually reconstruct our memories. We don't pull them out of a file stored and ready-made. They're not stored in the way that we think.
And we reconstruct them, but where is that information?
Yeah, the information is contained in the way that the brain accesses stored memories. So there are parts of the brain behind the forehead, round about this far back. It's like a little egg-shaped area of the brain, which has a couple of little parts in it. They call the hippocampus, which is the part which stores data and makes relationships between data. So everything that we understand is relative. So, for example, the way we understand everything is to classify it. We say, what group does this belong to? So if I hold this thing up and I say, look, this is a cup. When I think about the word cup, and we talk about cup, because I just showed you that one, that's the one we notice. But you think of all the cups you've ever seen. And in order to talk about cup and for the word to be useful, you have to ignore all the differences and just talk about the generalized thing called a cup. So if I say, so is that a cup? And you're going to say, no, of course it isn't. Well, what is a cup then? And you would describe the characteristics of a cup. And so anything that we call cup has those characteristics. It belongs in that group. And that's how we know everything. We know the names of things by what group they belong to. So we give them a rule about which group so that we can say, well, it has to have a handle and it has to be cylindrically shaped and it holds liquid and we drink from it. And so that tells you that's a cup. And so all of our understanding of the words and the experiences we have is constructed like that, is classified, if you like. So when we go back to the memory, what our body seems to do, what our nervous system seems to do, is collect all those data points. So it's make connections in the brain which force an image of that thing we call a cup and all the variations of it. And that's what we access when we remember drinking a cup of coffee with our breakfast and so on. We're accessing all the components of our memories of what all those words mean. So it's really very curious and very complex, much more complex than most of us realize.
Yeah, it's amazing. And while you were talking, two thoughts came to my mind, two implications actually. One is that, well, this is my interpretation anyway, somebody who knows less words is going to live a more limited life. But maybe it's too much of a presumption. And number two is what happens when we are exposed to new concepts that don't match with our idea. For instance, let's say a new concept of, I found a way of making stones fly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So can you elaborate on these two?
Sure, yes, because what happens is because of our experiences, we build those experiences as the structures that we know. And when somebody introduces something that we don't know, there's a challenge to our reality, because you think, hang on a minute, stones can't fly. Well, they can if you throw them, but they don't fly. And so on. And so there's a challenge to my understanding of something. And it's almost like I find myself saying, hang on a minute, you're telling lies. That's not true. Or I think, but what if it were true? How would I know? And so I start to imagine possible connections, and people with a high level of creativity, which is actually everyone before it gets spoiled, are capable of imagining such a thing and working out how it could happen. I mean, how is it that 30 years ago, Star Trek, a film about people being able to talk to one another on a spaceship looking at a little thing like this, and that was science fiction in those days. And now we have this thing where I can talk to you on Zoom and we're very, very far apart. So if we can imagine it, we can create it. If it's possible to create, given the physics of our situation. And so all of this is imagination. And one of the things that happens, of course, is when you challenge my reality, because my reality is based on my experiences. I say, I know this works. I know the sun comes up every morning, it gets light, and then it gets dark every day without fail. I know that's going to happen. That's not a belief, that's knowledge. But if you were to say, I'm absolutely certain that there really is a God and that I can worship God and God takes care of me, I don't have all the information to prove that, because I've never actually seen God. I've never actually spoken directly and had a response in a conversation. So in that sense, there's much of that I have to put to trust. It's like an act of faith. That's what we mean by faith, is believing in something without enough evidence to be sure. And so then when you challenge me with a different concept, one that doesn't fit my frame, either my frame will work out, nope, I don't agree, that's wrong, I refuse to accept that, prove it. And if you can't prove it, I'm not going to believe it. Or I can say, that's curious, I'm interested, I'm going to explore that idea, I like that idea, and I begin to find ways to adapt Now, how does that adaptation take place? Well, the brain is designed to make connections between neurons in different parts of the brain in order to make new pathways and connect concepts and ideas and thoughts in the brain. And so you've heard people talk about neuroplasticity. What they mean is the brain is capable of changing the connections it's making. In fact, it's probably making something like 18 million connections per second. Think about that, 18 million new connections per second. That shows how much activity is going on in there. This brain, even when you're asleep, is never still. It's on the move all the time. And so it's these new connections that enable new ideas to connect up with one another that really had nothing to do with one another before. All of a sudden, there's a new connection. You think, oh, yes, oh, and this, oh, and this, and this. And there's a new network of ideas in the brain. And the brain now is capable of perceiving something which before was invisible, was inaudible, but now I can notice it.
Yeah. What makes some people able to be flexible enough to consider new ideas and think, oh, this is interesting, this is a new concept, I'm going to do some research on this, or just no, this is not part of my reality, this is not true because this is the way things are. What's the difference between one and the other? Are we born that way? Do we have to train ourselves to be more flexible? What's the difference?
Well, in my experience, it's learned behaviour. There's a concept in neurolinguistic programming which was called something different by psychologists. Psychologists tend to call it our personality, but there's something in NLP that was labelled Metaprogams. What we mean by meta is it stands on the outside looking in. So it comments on. So a metaphor is a way of understanding something using something else to compare it to. And these meta programs are really observations of the way that we build habits of attention. There are certain things we notice in any given context. And so some people over the years grow up with an idea that what they tend to notice is the big picture. They tend to notice the general idea of everything. And for them, that they might call themselves global thinkers or creative thinkers. They see connections between things that nobody else notices, but that's only because they've grown up practicing seeing connections between things, and sometimes connections between things which don't seem to be related, and yet they can see one way of relating them. And so when you get used to paying attention like that, then you become a global thinker. Whereas there are other people who find it's easier for them to understand one step at a time. They look at the details in something and they construct their ideas from the ground up, from small details. It's like somebody who builds a brick wall by starting with one brick and then another brick and then another brick and then another, whereas somebody else sees the concept of the building and says this will be built with brick walls. So they see whole brick walls in structures. So they start, an architect might start from there and then end up having to draw the pattern of the brick laying, for example, but they start with the big picture and then go to detail. Other people start with the detail and end up constructing something that ends up with the big picture. So they're just different ways of paying attention to our environment. And my observation is that those differences between people are built on what happened to you when you were small, what you happened to notice in your environment, what your attention was directed to. You might have had a teacher who taught you things in great detail, a science teacher or a maths teacher, and you became fascinated by the detail. Maybe you played with Lego bricks and you were fascinated by how one little brick can make so many different shapes, even though the brick itself doesn't change, but the ways you can put them together. So it's whatever you end up noticing and you become habituated to noticing, and therefore that becomes your way of moving around in the world. It's what you pay attention to, how you pay attention to it, and it begins to form your way of being. So other people observe you as, you're a big picture thinker, or you're a little chunker, as we call them in NLP. You're detail conscious, or you're global in the way that you think. And so we begin to form habits of behavior which respond to what we happen to notice in our environment in any given context. And those habits become what you might call our personality or our personal style, really.
Yeah, so it's more nurturing. However, I'm thinking, Bill, of a person that I interviewed for this program,
Yeah.
Laura, she's Irish, and she is dyslexic. And she said to me, because I'm dyslexic, I tend to see things big picture, which is something that I had observed. You see things in a very global way very fast, because she attended some of the seminars that we did, our workshops, and she was one of the fastest learning stuff. So do you think there's something also physiological that helps us or leans us toward be more abstract thinkers, or rather than detailed thinkers? Is it a little bit of both, or is it overall the nurturing, the experiences that we have?
In my view, look, every human being is born, unless they're damaged during birth or pre-birth by their mother's experiences, for example. I mean, for example, when a baby's born, before a baby's born, it isn't separate. It's really so integral to its mother that it's like the mother, one of the mother's organs. The child isn't a separate human being. It's just like the mother's kidney or liver, or it's as much a part of the mother's body as that. So all of the mother's experience during pregnancy is the child's experience, just like the mother's heart is having the mother's experience, or the mother's lungs is having the mother's experience. So the child is as well. And so children are formed largely by their mother's experience. And so if their mother suffers trauma while they're pregnant, the child will be traumatized in the same way that the mother was. That will have an effect on the child's chemistry and their development.
Yes.
So there are long studies.
Yeah.
And so therefore, that's why when children are born, let's say brothers and sisters, they have very different personalities, don't they? You know, no two children are identical. Even identical twins are not. They're different, and so on. And so not only have you got the child formed with the mother's experience during pregnancy, but if you've got two children in there, in the same egg, so to speak, identical twins, even they, in their tiny containers, are having separate interpretations of the mother's experience. And so when they emerge onto the world, they emerge with a different attention span, a different type of way of interpreting their experience. And that seems to make all of us unique and different. But we're still born with all of the, assuming that our birth is undamaged and so on, so we have all the normal DNA and the structures, then we're learning from then on. We're adapting to whatever happens to us immediately. Immediately we're born, we're adapting to whatever's happening out here. And we continue to adapt. So children who develop dyslexia have developed a particular way of observing. And one of the characteristics of dyslexia seem to be that we don't actually see with our eyes. Our eyes gather data and they send it to the part of the brain that deals with visual information, mostly at the back. And what happens then is it's our brain that sees. And the brain of a child who develops dyslexia seems to have a facility for imagining the eyes could be up on the ceiling on the other side of the room, looking down this way, and then jumping around by the window, and then jumping over to the other side. So it's almost like the child's eyes move around like this, which is one of the reasons why they have difficulty focusing on words on a page, and the words seem to be flipping, because it's as if the eyes have gone around the other side and looking at it from backwards. And so very often this is what gives this ability to see this amazing three-dimensional, highly creative way, because for the rest of us who only have one fixed point of view, so to speak, the idea that somebody's eyes can move around and they can see things we can't suggests to us they're really creative. And that's one of the gifts of dyslexia, if you like. But for example, I run photo reading training where I train people in how to absorb written material very quickly. So if you can imagine turning over the pages of a book a page a second, like this kind of speed, you're actually exposing your eyes to upwards of 60,000 words a minute. Now, of course, that's not reading in the normal way. It's almost like downloading something into your brain. Your perceptive equipment is capable of taking that information in like that. We don't use it that way because nobody ever told us to, but it's possible. And so it's almost like your brain stores the whole book, and of course it gets the whole thing in 2 minutes, if it's a 200 or 300 page book. And then your brain can process that. What I've often found is people with dyslexia come to photo reading courses and they'll say to me, Bill, I have dyslexia. Do you think this can help? I mean, they're just desperately wanting to learn another way of reading. And what's wonderful is people with dyslexia very often, in fact, almost always, leave the workshop without their dyslexia. So they actually find a way to flip it. Because one of the other things that happens with people who have dyslexia is they find it difficult being sure which is their left and which is their right.
Yes.
And we have a way of working with, we do a game which changes their state, where they read the letters of the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, and so on. And there's an instruction immediately below the letter, which is an L, an R, or a T. So either left hand, right hand, or together. And so they'll be going A, B, C, D, E, F, G, I. But what they do, of course, because with dyslexia, the letters will tend to jump about, is we put a coloured spot on each hand, maybe a red spot on this one and a blue spot on that. And then the L is always written with the colour of the left hand, and the R is always written with the colour of the right hand. And so all they do is follow the colours. And what they find is this, making new connections across the central part of their brain called the corpus callosum. It makes new connections that they didn't have before. And it enables them to get a better sense of left and right. And it somehow kind of shifts some of what makes it difficult for them to operate. And then photo reading has a method which fixes a point of attention by imagining you can float a tangerine, just to make you laugh, a tangerine at the top back part of your head. And it enables you to focus visually. And it's a way that they teach children with dyslexia to focus and keep their eyes still rather than having them jump around the room. So these different methods that we use in photo reading enable people to make new connections in their brain plasticity, and therefore make corrections to their dyslexia and become capable of reading when they never could before. So It's a very exciting process. Dyslexia is a very, very interesting study.
It's fascinating. Because I interview Laura, after that I was watching some videos about dyslexia, and for children it's so frustrating while they are in school.
Indeed, yeah.
Because the rules of the game are set in a way that they can never win.
That's right. And because as well, one of the things that happens with children, because of the way their vision seems to jump around, sometimes it can create nausea. And the only way the child can reduce that is to get up and move. So, of course, they keep fidgeting and moving about. The teachers say, keep still, don't be naughty. And the child is just trying not to be sick. And so they say, oh, this child has ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, because the damn kid can't keep still. They don't behave themselves. But the child is just desperately trying to stay okay and not feel seasick. And so if teachers could understand that, they would make provision for children to move around. In fact, children do move around quite naturally. School is very unnatural to keep them sitting still. Right. That's not what children do. The children don't learn, they play. They make connections through playing. They don't think that they're learning anything, they're just playing.
Yes.
If young children are allowed to play, but their play is organised in such a way that it helps them make certain connections, then they will be educated very much quicker, and all the traumas of childhood will disappear.
It's so simple as just to look at nature, isn't it? Have you ever seen a cub or a baby, whatever animal it is, to be still there?
Not at all. All the time they're awake, they're moving. The only time they become still is when they go to sleep. So, I mean, if you want children to operate well, keep them moving.
Exactly. Fascinating. Just something that we left behind and that I would like to go back to, if that's okay.
Sure.
Words. Before I raised two things, I should have raised one, but the other one was somebody who has less words in their vocabulary, would they have more restricted experience of life? What do you think?
Yeah, well, it seems that there are some old civilizations. I think it might have been in Latin America. I'm not sure. And these people had no words for blue and for red. And so they didn't experience them. So for them, the sky was not blue because they didn't have a word to describe blue. In ancient Hebrew times, they didn't have any words for time. So having a clock or a watch or a sense of time was impossible. So what's that telling us? That's telling us that what makes our consciousness is putting words on our direct experience. You know, when we talked about metaphors before, if you think about the way words work, I mean, I sometimes when I'm working with this and giving people this training, I'll say to them, look, what I want you to do a little experiment. And this is an experiment about how do we know what words mean? And so I say, in a moment, I'm going to tell you one word. What I want you to do as the experiment is to notice the first thing that pops into your mind before you have time to think about what I just said. And are you ready? Here comes the word now. The word is beach. Now, most people say, oh, I saw sea or sand, but it was the feeling of hot sand and the grip between my toes. I remember in one international group, there was an Egyptian man said, loose woman. And a Jordanian sitting next to him said, big fuzzy fruit with stone in it. Because one had heard bitch and the other one had heard peach. And so whatever it was they got, that was how they represented. But the point I'm making with that is the first reaction that everyone has is a sensory one. They either see something. I mean, one woman said, oh, I smelled seaweed when you said that. That was the first thing that occurred to her, was the smell of the sea, and so on. Other people feel it. Somebody said beach ball, but it's not the image of the ball, it's the feeling of the ball tapping me on the head, and so on. So many people interpret that word beach according to whatever pops into their mind first. That's one of the ways that we know what words mean. We have a sensory reaction to it. Really what's going on is when we detect our environment, when we look out of our senses and we feel and we smell things and we move around, we're detecting our surroundings. The only way we know that they're there is when we put words on it. And in fact, detecting our surroundings happens first, and it's about half a second before the word comes out. So in fact, our attention, our consciousness of what's going on right now is actually lagging half a second behind the event itself. That's kind of weird, isn't it? When you think. So we only become conscious of something when we've named it. We need the word in order to become conscious of it. Doesn't mean we're not having the experience. It just means we don't know until we name it. So using our language to name everything is what makes us conscious that it exists. And so everything we know is going on. It's only going on because we have a linguistic map, a word map of it inside our nervous system. So you and I are looking at one another. We're watching the movements of our faces, the movements of our hands. We're hearing our voices. But the only way we know that is because the words that are being exchanged are being interpreted in your mind, in your language. And so, for example, I mean, this is another dimension about words. I ran a workshop in Uruguay 4 years ago, and I called it Lost in Translation. And the point I was making was that the only way you can understand what I'm saying is you interpret your meaning of my words, because that's all you have available to you. You're inside your skin, I'm inside mine. I'm throwing noises across the gap between us. You receive those noises and you think, oh, that means. And so, in fact, your understanding of everything I say can only be your personal, private understanding based on your experience of those words. If you have a different impression for a word, like, for example, when I talk about beach, you think about the image of the sea and I think about the smell of the seaweed, then we're not really talking about the same thing. We're using a word that both of us recognize, but we both recognize different aspects of it.
Yes.
And so therefore, what I was saying was, although we fool ourselves in thinking we understand one another, it's actually physically not possible. And that the most effective way to communicate ideas and get the best match possible is to put it in the form of stories. So if I tell you a story, if I'm trying to explain a concept and I say, look, for example, there was this lady I was speaking to just a month ago now, and she was telling, what I'm doing is I'm telling you, what I'm trying to explain to you is like this, what happened to this woman. So I'm using stories to explain my concept. You will reconstruct your own version of what you think I mean, what this woman looks like, what she sounds like, who she must have been, so on. You can't possibly know any of that. Even if I showed you a photograph, it's still only partial information. So you're going to create your internal impression of what I'm talking about. And that's the only thing that you can ever have. So even if you and I matched perfectly what I was saying and what you were hearing, there's no way we could ever know. There is no method for knowing it. All we can do is think I understand what you mean. In other words, we fool ourselves into believing we understand, but we don't. In other words, translating what I'm talking about is impossible. So everything gets lost in translation. That was the point I was making with that training. It's curious, isn't it, how many dimensions there are to this?
Yeah.
So that was a lovely question about words. Can you say then that if there is no word for something, then it doesn't exist?
Yeah.
In consciousness. Doesn't mean to say it doesn't exist objectively, but we've no idea what objective is. All we can possibly have is subjective experience. I can only know this cup is here because I can see it and I can touch it and I can move it. But that information is inside my nervous system, is my brain and my nervous system and my memories or my experiences, which are constructing my understanding that that is what I call a cup and my ability to recognize it. But in fact, I'm not experiencing that. I'm experiencing my internal impression of that. And that's what I deal with, my internal impression. So if you're looking at me and I think you just said something very rude and insulting, I'm going to respond as if, wow, why did you do that? Whereas in fact, you might have thought, what did I do? I wasn't insulting you. I was saying something nice. Well, it sounded like an insult to me. So whatever my interpretation is, that's my reality. So in other words, I'm not really dealing with you and what you say. I'm dealing with my internal impression of what I think you're saying, what I observe, what I interpret. That's all I've got available. So actually, I'm constantly talking with myself, really, not with you.
And we can choose, therefore, whether to suffer or to think that something is just positive or everything. Absolutely. We can make up our own lives.
Now I'm going to use a story to reinforce what my agreement with what you just said. Just recently, I went over to the UK to see a little boy of 8 years old who'd been suffering for 6 months, really suffering. He had a tummy bug about 6 months ago, and he was vomiting and feeling very sick. And ever since then, this poor little boy was terrified of being sick. And so he was so afraid of becoming ill and being sick that he would say to his father constantly, "Daddy, do I look sick? Do I look as if I'm going to be sick?" And he obsessed about this. So he would go to school and he would be frightened of going to school in case he was sick. And then regularly at 11 o'clock every single day, the school will call his dad and say, "Can you come and get him? He can't, he's going to pieces here." And this poor little boy just couldn't get through a day. And his father made contact with me and asked if I could help. And what I did with this little boy, I said to him, "You know, you seem to me that you've got a really great imagination." He said, "Yeah, I have." So I said, "Yeah, I know, I can tell." And I said, "Also, I'm going to tell you things that I wouldn't normally tell a little boy because most boys of your age couldn't understand this, but I know you can." And I explained to him about how our thoughts and our perceptions work. And I said to him, "So see, what's been happening?" And I put everything that he'd been experiences in past tense. What's been happening to you up until now for these last few months is you've been thinking about being sick. So in order to think about it, you imagine it. So it's almost like you're making a scary movie inside you and you're getting frightened by the scary movie. So I said, for example, let's suppose that you could wake up one morning really, really happy. If you woke up like that, how would you know? And he said, "I'll be excited." So I said, well, how do you know you're excited? He said, I feel excited. So I said, oh, right, something going on in there then. You feel something in your body. So he said, yeah. So I said, what color is it? He said, oh, it's like butterflies. Ah, butterflies. So I said, what color is it? So he said, yellow. So I said, oh, is that butter yellow or sunshine yellow? No, like lemons. Ah, right, lemon butterflies. And he said, yeah, lemon butterflies. And he was grinning all over his face. So I said, so you wake up with lemon butterflies. What happens then? He said, well, I get up. Yeah. And then what do you do? I have breakfast. So I said, oh, what do you have for breakfast? So he described all this rubbish that he would eat for breakfast. And he ended up describing a whole day from getting up in the morning, going to school, having a wonderful time, playing a lot and doing great things and all the food he ate, and then going to bed and relaxed and looking forward to waking up in the morning because he couldn't wait to wake up with butterflies. So he described in detail. I said, do you realize what you just did? You're a genius. Because I said to him, what would you like to be when you grow up? He said, I want to be a YouTuber. He said, I want to create loads of videos and content. I said, well, there you are. See, you're a film director. Do you realize you just made up a film of a fantastic day? He said, yeah, I did. So I said, and how did it feel when you were doing that? He said, great. I said, so why would you want to make up a film of being sick when you don't have to do that anymore? You could do this instead. What would that be like? Yeah, I'd like that. And his dad said every day, although he's been called a couple of times at 11 o'clock in the morning to go and see his son, he's gone into the school. He's reminded him, remember what you did with Bill? And every now and again, his son would say, yeah, but I do find it difficult to think, to make a happy film. And sometimes when I don't feel very well. And so his dad would say, yeah, but you do know how to do it. He said, yeah, I guess. And he said he's been at school and stayed at school every day. He started going in the evenings to his martial arts club and helping to teach the little children. And he's just beginning to get back to normal now. So isn't that beautiful in terms of you can think yourself happy? And one of the messages I gave this little boy was, do you realize you could be anything you could imagine? Just imagine what an amazing YouTuber you're going to be. You already are, really. You're just preparing for it when you can do it for real. And he said, yeah.
Wow.
So that's what we're talking about. That's what language can do. So I agree with you 100%. We can learn how to do that. And if you learn it at a young age, like 8 years old, I mean, you've got it forever. I remember being in the sauna once at the health club 30 years ago now. And there was this man saying, I'm retiring next week. He said, I'm really looking forward to it. He said, I've never had a day off work in my life. He said, I've been made redundant 3 times. And he said, every time I left my job on Friday and started the new one on Monday. He said, I can't understand these people who get all upset and anxious. Oh, losing my job. What am I going to do? He said, get another one. He said, my old mum used to say to me when I was little, you're a lucky boy, you are. You'll always be lucky. He said, and you know what? She was right. No, he was a lucky boy. He was lucky in that he had a mum who told him.
Yeah, he had no doubt whatsoever that he would find a job, and that was his reality, and he would create that.
Yeah, exactly. Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
I wonder what kind of retirement they had. Probably an amazing one, I could imagine.
Yes. I suppose we could always find something that we are very good at, or that we always make happen. And then other things that we don't make happen, we can say, hey, what am I doing with this that's happening all the time? Maybe I can translate that into this other aspect of my life.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, there's a method that we use in neurolinguistic programming when we're doing therapeutic changes with people. And it's something to do with the way they store their images and their memories. So, for example, when I remember a particular occasion where I might be feeling sad and upset about it or intimidated or something like that, I might say to the person who's telling me this, oh, when you think about that now, what's in your mind's eye is that picture that you're seeing moving, coloured, black and white, still. And they go, it's moving and it's black and white. And so, and then I get them to access a different memory, a more positive one that they is really great, like this one that you were talking about. And I say, when you think about that now, what happens? Tell me that picture, is it moving, black and white, coloured or still? Does it have a frame around it, or is it looking out of your eyes? And they'll say, oh, this one's coloured and it's moving. I'll say, oh, right. So look, take this picture that's black and white and still, and make it coloured and make it move, and move it over there. So take this picture and move it over there and change it to the same as the other one. And what they find is their reaction to that memory totally changes. So you're changing the way this person is storing a memory, because one of the ways that was observed that we store memories is in terms of pictures, smells, sounds, taste, feelings. And each of those pictures have characteristics. So not the contents of the picture, but the characteristics. So if the picture has a frame around it in our mind's eye, that's one way of storing a picture. Or it might be that we're remembering it just as the vision of our eyes, the panoramic view. It might be that the picture's up there somewhere, and whereas a different picture is held down here. And so when I think about that memory, I think of that one. And when I think about this one, I'm looking down here. And so, again, they have locations in space. So these are the different ways that we store our memories so that we know when we go back to them, yes, is that one. In other words, we have to have a way of recognizing. They're like memory hooks for that particular memory. If we change those memory hooks, we get a different experience. We can't go back to that one because we have to do that same thing every time. If we stop doing that and start doing something different, then the experience is different. We can't go back to that memory. It's not there anymore. And so that's one of the phenomenal things about the study of neurolinguistic programming, is this observation of the way that people do their storage of memories, and that they can change the way they store a memory and therefore change the experience. They can change the memory itself. I mean, that's kind of wonderful, isn't it? But if you think about it, that's what we're doing by different forms of thinking. If I think sad, in order to think sad, I have to have sad experience. I have to have sad components to make up that thought. If I think happy, I have to come with what I call happy components to make up that thought. And so I'm drawing on my fund of all these different experiences that I've had in my life to change them in a way that when I put them together, they work better for me.
It's fascinating what you're saying, Bill. And it seems that it's very easy if you know how.
Yes.
Is it as easy as you make it seem?
That's why people learn neurolinguistic programming, because they want to be able to do this. They know there's something like this in there. I mean, one of the things I would say is I started studying this 35 years ago. And so I spent 35 years developing my observations and my understandings. So I go to many of these details much more quickly than many other people can, because they didn't get on the road as early as I did. So I'm further along the motorway, so to speak. But yes, it's learnable because it was studied, it was encoded, it was described, so that information is available. And with a competent trainer of neurolinguistic programming, you can learn how to do what I'm doing.
Like yourself, where can our audience find you? All the courses, maybe books or workshops, or where can we find you?
I guess the best representation of me at the moment is on LinkedIn, my professional kind of. And certainly people can contact me through my LinkedIn profile. My LinkedIn profile ends with Bill Phillips, NLP. That's the easy way to recognize that it's me.
We'll put it here.
Yeah.
So everybody can find you, and also below.
Yes, indeed. And then also, of course, this is one of my email addresses. This is the easy one, the one that I use mostly. Phillips Bill at 38@gmail.com. So those are the ways to get in contact with me, certainly. Yeah.
To finish up, Bill, even though I will be here listening to you with my jaw dropping for hours and hours, but maybe in the future we can have you back in the program with some of the content if you want. But I would like to ask you, all of these 35 years that you've been practicing NLP, what has it given you?
That's a good question. It's challenging because it's given me many, many things. It's given me my livelihood, if you like. It's given me a huge privilege in that with hundreds, maybe even thousands of people, I've been allowed to talk to them about their hopes and their fears, about, when you're in a coaching session with someone who you genuinely want to support and guide and assist through a difficult period, people are going to end up telling you things. I mean, they often say to me things like, I don't know how it is, I'm telling you things I wouldn't even tell myself, let alone my wife or my daughter and so on. And for me, that's a huge privilege to get that close to another human being just for a while they're wading through the swamp. And when we get outside the other side of the swamp and they can wash themselves down and feel better, and then they don't need me anymore, they go off and live the rest of their life. And it's nice every now and again to touch base. That's a great privilege. And I think that more than anything is what it brings to me. It's a kind of universal way of having love in your life, I guess. That's precious. There are so many other things attached to that, but for me, that's the bit that stands out when you ask me that question.
Thank you. It's beautiful, and it can be felt through the screen that you're doing what you love, that you took action on your call inside, and you're getting from it as much as the other person gets from you practicing it. So it's a back and forth, which makes it
Absolutely. It's a total sharing of experience. And sometimes when people say, what is coaching? I say, well, if you can imagine walking along a path, you're just going for a stroll, and all of a sudden you realize there's someone walking along beside you, and you say, oh, hello, how are you doing? And they say, oh, I'm not doing very well at the moment. I'm struggling. Oh, really? So what's going on then? And you have a conversation where they touch your heart and you think, I've got some ideas. Have you thought about this? Or what is it you really want? So on. And you have this conversation, and maybe you wade across a river and you wade through a swamp, and you get to the other side, and then they say, well, okay, look, thanks for the conversation. That was very nice. Bye. And then you realize they're walking away thinking, oh my God, I'm not sad anymore. And they look back and think, what was that? I think that's a kind of metaphor for my way of thinking about coaching. Like we walk alongside somebody for a while and leave them feeling happier than when they met us. If we can do that, that's pretty good work.
Wow, so inspiring to see that you're touching so many lives.
That's a great privilege for me. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for doing so. Thank you for doing so.
Pleasure.
Well, as I said, you're welcome to come to the program anytime. And it's been an honor to have you here. A great privilege. A great privilege. Bill.
Me too. Yeah, and you too. Thank you, Anna. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.